Hello and welcome to Scotland, or in Scotland's other major language, Scots Gaelic, Falchigu Alapa. I'm glad you've decided to come to our beautiful and very friendly country to pursue your studies, and I hope that you will enjoy your time with us. My name is Lizanne Henderson, and I'm a Scottish Canadian, and I'm a senior lecturer in history and tourism and animal studies here on the campus. My main research areas are the Scottish witch hunts, the cultural history of animals, Arctic studies, and in tourism, I cover heritage management and wildlife tourism. I've been working here at the Dumfries campus for quite a long time now. I came here back in 2004. Before that, I was living in Glasgow, where I did my PhD at the University of Strathclyde. And before that, I was studying in Canada at the University of Guelph and then Memorial University of Newfoundland. Now, by now, you should have figured out that you're not studying in the city of Glasgow. Our campus is about 70 miles south of Glasgow in the southwest of Scotland, an area that is noted for its pretty agricultural landscapes, the Seven Stains mountain bike trails, belted Galloway cattle, and cream of Galloway ice cream, which I strongly recommend that you try. Dumfries is a town where in the 14th century, King Robert the Bruce, arguably the most famous king in Scottish history, murdered his rival for the throne, John Comyn, at Greyfriars Church. Bruce was crowned 6 weeks later in 1306, and he went on to win the most famous battle in Scottish history, the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, gaining Scotland's freedom from the oppression of the English under the reign of Edward II. This was such a momentous occasion that still to this day, you will hear people singing Flower of Scotland, the unofficial national anthem, which is about Bruce's victory at Bannockburn, sending Edward south to think again. Dumfries itself is situated on the River Nith, which leads into the Solway Firth and then out to the Atlantic Ocean. It's also known as the last residence of Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns, who worked in Dumfries in the 18th century as an exciseman, which is another word for a tax collector, in between composing world-famous poems and collecting traditional songs and ballads as well. Burns composed lots of things you might have heard of, some you might not have. One you've probably heard of is Auld Lang Syne, which means days gone by. Many people around the world sing this on New Year's Eve. You've probably done this yourself. You will hear a lot about Burns when you're in Dumfries, but the town was also the home of J.M. Barrie, author of Peter Pan, The Boy Who Never Grew Up, and more recently, if you're into dance music, you might have heard of Calvin Harris. He's also a Doon Hamer, or a person from Dumfries. Dumfries has a long history. It was made a royal borough in 1186 by King William the Lion. In the medieval period, it became quite a flourishing market town, mostly due to the fact that it had a port at nearby Glencapel, which meant that wool and animal skins and such like could be exported, and nice things like wine and spices imported. The town, and indeed the whole region, suffered a lot during the various conflicts between Scotland and England. And this is probably because it's right on the borderlands. The English burned Dumfries to the ground on more than one occasion. In the 13th century, the Franciscan order of friars came into town. They became known as the Grey Friars because of the costumes that they wore. The beautiful old bridge down on the White Sands, called Dervagilla's Bridge, was built in 1431 in honour of Dervagilla, a woman who was born into a powerful family of Galloway landowners at Kenmure Castle. The castle is now a big ruin, and incidentally, I can actually see that same castle from my kitchen window, so I'm quite lucky. Dervagilla, she was the mother of the Scottish King John Balliol. She bequeathed money to the University of Oxford to set up Balliol College, which is still on the go to this day. She's also the woman who loved her husband so much that when he died in 1268, she had his heart embalmed, and then she kind of carried the heart around with her everywhere she went. In 1273, she founded the last Cistercian house to be built in Scotland, called Sweetheart Abbey, in New Abbey, very close to Dumfries. And she and her husband's hearts were buried there together. Some people think this story is very romantic. Personally, I find it very creepy. The Abbey is a very popular tourist attraction now, run by Historic Environment Scotland, so you might get a chance to visit it when you come here. The mid-steeple, as you can see, just making sure I was on the right PowerPoint there, the mid-steeple, as you can see there on the top right-hand corner there, a kind of tower-like structure. You might have seen it already on the High Street in Dumfries. It was built in 1707, originally to function as a court and as a prison. This is actually the same year that Scotland and England entered into a full incorporating union, giving up their respective independence in order to become the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Scotland and England had already agreed back in 1603 to a union of the crowns, which meant that they shared the same monarch, but were otherwise independent nations. Now this came about because the English Queen, Elizabeth I, she was the daughter, and some would say illegitimate heir, of Henry VIII, the last of the House of Tudor. She does not marry, and so she did not produce any heirs. This meant that the line of succession carried over to the Scottish House of Stuart, a claim that Mary Queen of Scots, also seen there on the PowerPoint, arguably Scotland's most famous queen, tried to make while her cousin Elizabeth was in power, that Mary should have been the queen and not Elizabeth, and was one of the reasons why Mary found herself imprisoned in England for 19 years until she was eventually found guilty of treason for allegedly conspiring against Elizabeth, and she was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle in 1587. Now, despite what you may have seen in movies and television, the two queens never actually met one another. They never met in person. Mary did marry. She married 3 times, in fact, and she did leave an heir behind. She left a son. Mary's son was James VI of Scotland. He would become, on the death of Elizabeth, next in line for the English throne, which he accepted, ruling over both countries as James I of England in 1603. Now, James is a fascinating character. One of the things he did that was highly unusual was to write a book in 1597 called Demonology, arguing for the reality of witchcraft. And he did this because he believed that he had personally been the target of a huge coven of witches conspiring against him in North Berwick to try and kill him and his wife, Anne of Denmark, in 1589. The witches did this by performing a spell to create a huge storm to sink their ships, by throwing cats. They took the cats and they swung them over their heads and then threw them into the ocean, which would cause the seas to boil and to cause the ships to, what they had hoped to happen, to sink. James was, needless to say, very angry about this attempt on his life, and so he instigated the largest witch hunt Scotland had ever seen up until this point, and many suspects were put to trial, and some of them were executed. When James moved to England, he kind of loses interest in witches, and though this isn't necessarily reflected in all aspects of culture, William Shakespeare, for example, added 3 witches to his play Macbeth because of James's reputation as a witch hunter. But once again, James's life was in danger, this time from Guy Fawkes and Robert Catesby, who tried, though failed, to blow up the Houses of Parliament in London, the so-called Gunpowder Plot, a day that is remembered in England as Guy Fawkes Night on the 5th of November. By the end of the 17th century, Scotland had experienced a lot of bad luck. The 1690s were a particularly bad time, lots of bad weather, so bad that the crops failed, leading to mass starvation, disease, and death. Furthermore, it had put all of the country's wealth into trying to set up an overseas colony in Central America, in Panama, called the Darien Venture, which was actually the idea of a man from Dumfries called William Patterson. It turned out the Scots were not particularly suited to hot tropical climates, and many succumbed to malaria and other diseases. There was also the little issue that the Spanish had already claimed the territory for themselves. They were not exactly happy about the Scots being there, and warfare ensued. The result was the colony failed, spectacularly so, and the Scottish settlers who did manage to survive were forced to leave Panama, and Scotland went into major financial debt. The opportunity to form a union with England by this point had no longer seemed such a bad idea. In previous attempts leading up to this, they had always said absolutely not, but now they were thinking maybe this was a good opportunity, at least to the men in charge. It was not at all popular with the people at large, but they didn't have a vote back then. Lengthy negotiations took place, and the Union of 1707 was finally achieved, for good or ill. It remains a highly contentious issue to this day. One of the so-called positives, and I use that term with great care, was that it opened up the world to them as never before, becoming part of the wider British Empire and conquering large parts of the world. Some people are proud of this history, others are not and are quite ashamed of it. It also meant that Scots got involved in the transatlantic slave trade, profiting immensely from the money to be made in trading slaves and from tobacco, cotton, sugar, and so on that the slaves were forced to produce. You will still see evidence of this in the city of Glasgow, that made a lot of money out of tobacco in particular. These sad days recalled in some of the street names, such as Jamaica Street, or less obvious, Buchanan Street or Glassford Street, which are named after powerful tobacco lords or tobacco merchants who essentially built much of the city that you see today. It is a painful history, but one that the city and indeed the country is beginning to acknowledge and face up to. Many young men from Dumfries and Galloway headed to the Americas and the Caribbean in the 18th century, and many were involved, I'm afraid to say, in some way with slavery or with plantation life. A lot of the big houses in this region were built from money made in sugar profits and so on. Slave trading on British ships was eventually abolished in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833. Now, what about some of Scottish culture? I've mentioned that the folk from Dumfries are called Doonhamers, that they're from down home, the kind of southern part of Scotland. And the poor souls, they will hate me for saying this, they support a football team called Queen of the South. The Scots in general are very fond of football, and there's a lot of rivalry among team supporters. Mostly this is good-natured, though occasionally not. Queen of the South, they've been playing at Palmerston Park in Dumfries since 1919, so they're quite an old team. Football is by far the most popular spectator sport in Scotland, but there are other popular sports, such as rugby. The Dumfries team are called the Saints. Curling, Dumfries has its own ice bowl. Golf, there are lots and lots of golf courses throughout all of Scotland, including here in Dumfries and Galloway. The most famous are probably at St Andrews and also Gleneagles. And some actually credit the Scots with inventing the game of golf, but this is not absolutely certain. Rowing, the Dumfries Club is the Nithsdale Amateur Rowing Club. And tennis, you may have heard of a very famous Scottish tennis player by the name of Andy Murray, former world number one. He won Wimbledon twice, as far as I know, and twice at the Olympics too, I think. Netball, this is a game mostly associated as being played by women and girls. And field hockey can be played by both genders, but it's very popular with women. Ice hockey never used to really be a thing in Scotland, but it is catching on a little in popularity. Dumfries have the Solway Sharks, and in Glasgow, they have the Glasgow Clan. Cricket, a little less popular in Scotland than in neighbouring England, but there are Scottish cricket clubs too. And shinty, a game that you may not have heard of, it's a game played with wooden sticks. It kind of looks like field hockey, wooden sticks and a ball. It's more associated with the Highlands of Scotland than with the Lowlands, and in the Highlands it's a very popular game indeed. Scotland is famous for many things, but probably the most famous thing is that our men wear kilts. Now, whatever you do, don't call it a skirt. They don't like that. The kilt is essentially a skirt, but you didn't hear me say that, is made from tartan tweed. The tartans are a type of plaid. They come in many different colours, representing a particular family name. Originally, these would have been restricted to Scottish clan names, but now just about anybody's surname can be made into a tartan. So for instance, I would wear the Henderson tartan, which is the tartan that you see there on the PowerPoint. Now, Henderson is not, it is a Scottish name, but it's not a clan name as such. It simply means Henry's son. And you do get that name in other countries too, such as in Scandinavia, where it's Henriksson. It's basically the same name. A clan name would be something like Fraser or Cameron or MacLean or MacDonald or Mackenzie. Mac is simply a Gaelic word for son. In the past, they used to also use Nick. So, you know, Nick Mackenzie or Nick Donald, Nick Clane, Nick meaning daughter, but we hardly ever use that anymore. Tartan is actually not all that old in the scheme of things, possibly originating in the 1600s, but it really takes off in a big way, not until the late 17th and into the 18th centuries. Following the Jacobite defeat at the Battle of Culloden, the wearing of tartan or kilts was actually banned by the Act of Prescription in 1746. The story of the Jacobites is a long and painful one, but it was basically a series of battles and uprisings in an attempt to restore the overthrown Stuart dynasty. Jacobite basically means a follower of Jacobus, which is the Latin word for James, the name of the Stuart king who was deposed at the end of the 17th century. And then his son, and then followed on with his grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, continued to rally support from the loyal Jacobites, leading to the fateful battle at Culloden in 1746, in which Charlie's supporters were soundly beaten by the government forces led by the Duke of Cumberland. Unfortunately for the Jacobites, or anyone brave enough to help them, their troubles did not end with the battle. But there followed several years of oppression by the British government to crush the Jacobites once and for all. Hence why tartan was banned, but also bagpipes were banned. Speaking Gaelic, it wasn't banned exactly, but it was made very difficult for Gaelic speakers. The clan chiefs were stripped of many of their powers, and several hundreds, possibly thousands of soldiers and civilians were persecuted, shipped off to the colonies, or indeed murdered. The Stuart lineage was never reinstated to the British throne, and it is currently occupied by the House of Windsor under Queen Elizabeth II, though in Scotland she is regarded as Queen Elizabeth I. Anyway, there are a few other basic things that you should know about living in Scotland before I leave you. And one is the weather. You will soon discover that the Scots love to talk about the weather, which is slightly odd because the weather is mostly the same. That is, it's wet, it's rainy, it's grey, sometimes a bit windy. The most common description when you listen on the news to the weather forecast is scattered showers with some bright spells. It hardly ever deviates from that. And it's also one of the most common conversation starters when you're meeting people. You know, you pass somebody in the hallway, how's it going? Nice day today, or it's not. If you're in a shop or a coffee shop, at a bus stop, anywhere, where you might be meeting people. You know, how are you? Miserable day, isn't it? And if the weather does deviate from its usual cold, grey and miserable, which is rare, but does sometimes on occasion happen, you'll start to hear the Scots complain. Oh, it's awfully warm. Oh, it's too hot, you know, waiting for the cold weather to return. If the thermometer goes above 18 degrees, it's declared a heat wave. Now, if you come from a warm country, you will find this very strange. Alternatively, if it drops below 2 degrees, you'll hear folks say, oh, it's Baltic, positively Baltic. And if it should snow, well, then it's the apocalypse. Snow will cause a total shutdown of schools, public transport, and even some roads. If you come from a cold country, you will find this very strange. Now, besides the weather, there are a few other things you should know about the Scots. They like to eat strange food, such as offal, or the organs of a sheep wrapped up in a sheep's stomach. This is known as haggis. And if you are brave enough, you should try some. It's actually quite delicious, and it even comes in a vegetarian version. For those not brave enough to stomach, get it? The original meat version. Personally, I stick to the vegetarian version. Haggis is normally served with neeps and tatties, which is a Scots term for turnips and mashed potatoes. Usually served with a dram of whiskey, another national obsession, and is traditionally served at special occasions, notably the 25th of January, which is Burns Night, and the 30th of November, which is St. Andrew's Night. Sometimes you might be offered it for breakfast, which brings me to another Scottish delight, the full Scottish breakfast, which is pretty much identical to a full English breakfast, save for the haggis option. Typical breakfast, should you be brave enough to try it, will consist of a fried egg, fried bacon, fried sausage, fried bread, fried tomato, a fried tatty scone, fried black pudding, baked beans, buttered toast, and a cup of tea or coffee, just to wash all that grease down your thrapple, as we would say in Scotland, down your throat. Basically, the Scots like to fry everything that they eat. They deep fry fish, they deep fry chicken, sausages, pizza, even chocolate bars, and they serve them all with fried chips or French fries with lots of salt and vinegar, washed down with a can of iron brew. Now, if you escape from the towns and the cities, and I would strongly encourage you to do so, get out there into the countryside, and if eating the Scottish breakfasts haven't given you a coronary, a most pleasant thing to do is to look out for wildlife. Scotland is home to a rich biodiversity of plant and animal life on land and in sea. Our most famous animal, though, it's not the red deer, the so-called monarch of the glen. It's not the Scottish wildcat, though you'd be very lucky to see one of them. They're extremely rare. The capercaillie, the golden eagle, the red squirrel, the red fox, otters, puffins, minke whales, dolphins, or seals. All of these are famous animals, but it's not the most famous. Nor is it the natterjack toad, an endangered species that can be seen very close to Dumfries here on the Solway coast. Nor is it the adder, the only venomous snake found in the whole of the UK. It's not even Hamish the polar bear, who was born at the Highland Wildlife Park in 2017, though he's very famous now, and all of these amazing animals can be seen in Scotland. Our most famous animal is one that very few people have seen. None have been able to catch it or even prove its existence. It's a cryptid, we would say. It's a cryptozoological animal. Anybody want to have a guess? It is the Loch Ness Monster. Affectionately known by the Scots as Nessie, the monster allegedly lives in Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands. The very first documented sighting of the monster is actually very old, seen by none other than Saint Columba, an Irishman who was largely responsible for bringing Christianity to Scotland back in the 6th century. In 565, it was recorded that Saint Columba and his monks encountered a great beast that roared at them in the river Ness, and Columba was able to drive the beast away into Loch Ness, where it has remained ever since. Now, I hope you have enjoyed this quick ramble through Scotland's history and culture. It leaves me just to say welcome to the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and welcome to Scotland, Falchagú Alapa. Taf pa leave, thank you, agus mar sin leave an drosta, and goodbye for now. See you later.